When do you stop and help? When do you walk by? The story of the Good Samaritan challenges us to ask these questions. I suspect we have all done both, stopped to help and walked by. In his sermon on being a good neighbor, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. engages this familiar story in a novel way by reminding us that the story really begins with the question, who is your neighbor? Our neighbor, suggests King, is anyone to whom we are neighborly. Jesus defines a neighbor not in a theological definition, King writes, but in a life situation. In other words, a neighbor is defined by how one chooses to act. To whom do you act neighborly? The big twist in the story of the Good Samaritan, of course, is that the one who chooses to help is a Samaritan man. The Samaritans identify as descendants of the tribes of Israel who formed the northern kingdom in ancient times. Despite shared Jewish ancestry, in the Christian biblical text, it is clear that the Samaritans are seen as lesser by the Jews of the south. According to Catholic.com, quote, because of their imperfect adherence to Judaism and their partly pagan ancestry, the Samaritans were despised by ordinary Jews. Rather than contaminate themselves by passing through Samaritan territory, Jews who were traveling from Judea to Galilee or vice versa would cross over the River Jordan, bypass Samaria by going through Transjordan, and cross over again as they neared their destination. End quote. To cross a river twice simply to avoid contact signals an amount of disdain and even disgust that is significant. Consider what it may have been like to be a Samaritan confronted with such prejudice and bigotry. The Samaritan in the story had plenty of reason to keep on walking and to not make the wounded Jewish man on the side of the road his problem. And yet, he stops. For Dr. King and many other preachers, the story of the Good Samaritan is lifted up as an example of good moral action. But what exactly, asks King, makes the Samaritan good? Dr. King begins his sermon by saying, I should like to talk to you about a good man whose exemplary life will always be a flashing light to plague the dozing conscience of mankind. His goodness was not found in a passive commitment to a particular creed, but in his active participation in a life-saving deed. Not in a moral pilgrimage that reached its destination point, but in a love ethic by which he journeyed life's highway. He was good because he was a good neighbor. For King, the measure of goodness is the man's deeds as a good neighbor. Being a good neighbor or neighborly might seem like platitudes coming from someone who did not live as King did. By the time King wrote this sermon in 1962 or 63, his house had been bombed, and he had been arrested, assaulted, and threatened. In that same 1963 summer that the book containing this sermon was published, King delivered his I Have a Dream speech in Washington and then officiated the funeral for 3 of the 4 children killed at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. Dr. King's words were not platitudes, but clarion calls for compassionate moral action in the face of violence, injustice, and heartbreak. In the final years of Dr. King's life, he turned his action to addressing poverty. Why? In a Big Think blog, writer Stephen Johnson suggests 4 reasons, beginning with the need for broader equality in society to ensure the success of the civil rights movement. To illustrate, Johnson quotes King, who in 1967 said, "Now we are in a new phase, and that is a phase where we are seeking genuine equality, where we are dealing with hard economic and social issues, and it means the job is that much more difficult. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income. It's much easier to integrate a bus than it is to get a program that will force the government to put billions of dollars into ending slums." Did you know that King spoke of a guaranteed national income? I didn't until very recently. But as I reflected upon this and read more of King's words, it began to make sense. King's dream was always of an equal society. While dismantling the bigotry of racial difference is part of the equation, the need for economic systems that allow people to live, work, and survive with dignity is another. As some of you have heard me say before, at times in my life I have lived on and survived by government programs. For several years when my son was young, I gratefully relied on the WIC program. Designed for women and infants, WIC provided formula, cheese, eggs, cereal, and other food staples for families with young children who are struggling economically. Even as a graduate student at Harvard, when my son was in elementary school, I relied on free and discounted lunches, as well as scholarships for after-school programs and summer camps. Growing up middle class in Michigan, I didn't even know about such programs, but they made a huge difference in our lives as a young family. Well, for years now, my economic situation has been far more stable. The experience of living in an economically fragile place left its mark. I have not forgotten what it looks like and what it feels like to sometimes wonder about how to buy food or pay the bills. Maybe you too have felt this. Perhaps this is why when the pandemic began last March, my first donations were to Feed America, to support food banks. More recently, I have been learning about the Chelsea Eats program, began last fall. As a community, Chelsea was already struggling before the pandemic began. In just 2.5 square miles, there are 50,000 residents, many of whom worked jobs in food service, hospitality, or Logan Airport, jobs that disappeared quickly when the pandemic began. Even before COVID, more than 60% of Chelsea residents were food insecure, those empty refrigerators, and nearly 1 in 5 were living in poverty. With the pandemic, these numbers have only grown. Chelsea is an incredibly diverse city with 75% of residents identifying as Latinx, and with more than 45% of the residents foreign-born, compared to a statewide rate of 16% foreign-born. For those without documentation, this means they are locked out of state and federal benefits designed to support the most vulnerable among us, programs like the WIC I was on. In response, Chelsea Eats was created to connect people with resources that people need to support food stability. While part of the program connects eligible residents to state-sponsored programs, they are also piloting the largest guaranteed income program in the country. Approximately 2,000 families are receiving $200 to $400 per month through a debit card to help pay for their basic needs. Under research by scholars at the Harvard Kennedy School, this pilot is being watched as a path to addressing food insecurity and economic instability for those struggling in poverty. Initially funded through city and philanthropic resources, they are currently seeking individual donors who will signal grassroots interest in supporting such basic income programs. $400 supports a family for a month. In the 1967 volume, Where Do We Go From Here?, Dr. King wrote about poverty while advocating for a guaranteed income. Critiquing prior and current events to address poverty as piecemeal and falling short, he wrote, quote, "I'm now convinced that the simplest approach will prove to be the most effective. The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by a now widely discussed measure, the guaranteed income." End quote. Rather than attempt to solve poverty only by indirect programs addressing housing, education, family, and so on, Dr. King suggested a focus on getting people income. Poverty, after all, is a money problem. Admittedly, Dr. King's understanding of a guaranteed income focused more on government efforts to create jobs than on Andrew Yang's proposal of sending out $1,000 checks. And yet, the underlying principle was the same. Address poverty by giving people money to meet their essential needs. I wonder then what Dr. King's response to the poverty of the pandemic might be. Thinking of the story of the Good Samaritan, I wonder if the economically battered immigrant who is struggling to simply eat and to not die of COVID might be our stranger at the side of the road. If so, we've had many reasons to pass on by, as we've also had to weather the disruptions and stressors of the pandemic. Additionally, many of us may have rushed by while focused on our important struggle for our democracy. But could it be that now we might choose to stop, choose to act neighborly on behalf of those most battered and vulnerable by this storm? This is not to presume that many of us have not already been supporting food banks and other programs. Indeed, I know many of you have been busy with Feeding Turning Point. We have also been sharing our plate every week with an outside organization in recognition of how great the needs are right now. And yet, on this Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, perhaps we might pause and consider our path and our actions. Is there a stranger, a group of strangers to whom we might be neighborly? Earlier in our service, we heard, or some of us could hear, the song King for a Day by Jason Shelton. The lyrics ask us, "He had a dream for you and for me. What will we do with it? Who will we be?" Perhaps these lyrics or this sermon feel like a string of obligatory platitudes for Martin Luther King Jr. weekend. Or perhaps we might hear these questions, this call to be a good neighbor, as wisdom wrought from a struggle pointing a way forward. This is not to suggest that being neighborly is easy or that it will not cost us our time, our money, or our energy. But perhaps the truth is that acting from an ethic of love in service of others is simply a good thing to do. Perhaps, like the Good Samaritan, we too might find ways to actively participate in life-saving deeds for those lying battered by the economic bully of this pandemic and this racialized, unequal society. So may it be. Amen.